We're now on talk 12, which I think is going to be the final talk in the series on Galatians, and I'm continuing with this roundup of miscellaneous ad hoc ancillary verses and passages which corroborate, confirm, amplify, explain the letter to the Galatians, and which help to show that what Paul was saying in Galatians is not unique to Galatians, and that the rest of the New Testament is entirely consistent with Galatians, for the benefit of those who think that it isn't. So let's continue. We're still in Hebrews, as we were last time. Hebrews 10 verse 9. Okay, now in case anyone is thinking we just aren't being sufficiently clear so far, and that Paul just isn't clear enough, or that the Bible isn't clear enough. Okay, here's another verse. He says, "Then he added, Lo, I have come to do thy will." He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. Okay? Now the word used for abolish, yet another Greek word, and there's a reason for that, because it's to show shades of meaning, but also to show the unmistakable reality of the position. So it's like if you wanted to say something, but instead of just using one word, you used 5 or 6 synonyms, all meaning pretty much the same, just to completely emphatically make it clear what you mean. Yeah? It's a little like that. So here the word used is anerio, meaning to set aside, put to death, get rid of, or even kill. And it says, I have come to do thy will. He abolishes, he anerios the first. What's the first? The law of Moses, in order to establish the second. What's the second? The new covenant. So which part of that is not clear? When you read that in the context of what we've been speaking of, because remember this is the very next chapter after Hebrews 9 and 8 and 7, in which we've been talking about these very things. So it's not as if I'm taking this out of context, and in fact he's talking about something else. He's talking about this. This is the same letter we're reading from. So what he's saying here, the writer, Paul I think, but whoever he is, he's saying the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant cannot both be in operation simultaneously. They're mutually exclusive, inconsistent things, both good but both inconsistent. The law of singleness and the law of marriage can't be in operation at the same time. The status of a will before death and the status of a will after death are utterly different, aren't they? Prior to death, a will is just a prospective thing, a contingent thing, which has no legal status whatsoever at all. You can rip it up, you can stop it, you can change it, you can do what you like with it. But at the point of death, you can't do a thing with it. At the point of death, it crystallizes, it comes into operation. It now is the new status of that man's estate. He used to be a man with assets. Now he has an estate. The estate stands in his place and is what used to be him. Do you see? So now you no longer speak of him, you speak of the estate. Do you see the point? You can't be you and have an estate. These are totally, legally, mutually exclusive words that can't operate together. And so the law of Moses and the new covenant can't operate together. And in case we're doubting as to, yeah, but how do we know that Jesus is bringing in the new covenant? Maybe it's talking about someone else. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24. It says, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, okay, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks more graciously than the blood of Abel. So, I mean, there isn't any doubt anyway, but just in case anybody wants to entertain a doubt as to who we're talking about, we're speaking about Jesus bringing into operation the new covenant. Now let's look at James, moving away from Paul, because I want to just come back to James. I've mentioned him previously, but it's useful to mention James because in a talk that deals with corroborating, confirming Paul, because many would assume that James is the opposite of Paul, that James disagrees with Paul. They have no basis for thinking it, but people nonetheless think it. They think that James disagrees with Paul. He absolutely doesn't. So James, the brother of Jesus Christ, absolutely agrees with Paul. And we need to understand his letter in its proper context. And when you do understand it in its proper context, bearing in mind his letter, James, alongside Acts chapter 15, in which James is the star of the show at the Jerusalem Council. James is the man who sums up and totally endorses Paul in Acts 15. But in his own letter as well, he endorses Paul if you understand him correctly. So let's look at James. We've got here James chapter 2, verse 14 to 26. And let's look at some of these verses. So verse 14, he says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith but has not works? Can his faith save him?" Now this word works is a word that confuses people. Now because we are told that we're not saved by works of the law, that has entered into people's mind a kind of allergic reaction to the very word works. Do you see? So we're not saved by works of the law, but that doesn't mean that we should recoil with horror from the word works, because the Bible tells us that we were saved for good works. That's our very purpose. So the word works, there's nothing wrong with the word works, but I say that because if you go to certain churches, if the word works is even mentioned, there's a kind of recoiling, as if you've said something almost pornographic or occultic or something terrible. There's nothing wrong with works. The problem is works of the law. We are saved unto good works, but we're not saved unto works of the law of Moses. Do you see? Now, what's James talking about? He's speaking of this thing called works as an evidence of faith. It's the smoke that goes with the fire of faith. So works are the smoke that is emitted by the fire that is called faith. So if you see in the distance smoke coming up, and you've got a massive IQ like me, what do you think? You think there could be a fire over there, because the smoke coming up tells you that there's a fire, because smoke doesn't tend to come up on its own without a fire. So what James is saying is, if you're telling me you've got faith, show me the smoke so I can see that there is faith. Show me the smoke so I can see there's a fire. And if you're telling me you've got a fire but there's no smoke coming up, why are you telling me you've got a fire? Do you see? That's what James is saying. He's not objecting to fire. He's not objecting to faith. He's saying, I want to see that your faith actually is real, and I'd like to see some evidence of it. And the evidence, which I would like to see, is a changed life, new attitudes, new conduct, the absence of what you used to do, the beginning of new things that you didn't used to do. Not because those things will make you righteous, but because those things would, in my view, constitute evidence of you having a real faith. That's what James is talking about. So when he speaks of works, he doesn't mean, let me see you observing the law of Moses. He doesn't mean that. He means works. That's what he means. And he goes on to tell you what he means. So in verse 15, if a brother or sister is ill-clad and in lack of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what does it profit? So what he's saying is, if you're some kind of phony that purports to care for people, and you know there's someone in the church, someone in your local church who's got a problem, and you say, I really, really feel for you, just really, get yourself home, get some good food in you, that's what you need, and get yourself well dressed and some good warm shelter. That's what you need. That's my advice to you. What he's saying is, what use is that? That's what he means. And if you're just saying that, in what sense are you any good to anybody? He means if you want to respond appropriately, do something about it. And then your doing something about it would, in James's view, be sufficient to convince him that you're not phony and that you're for real. That's what he means. So you see a man comes into the church, he's joined the church, the fella is starving, and you've brought some food for you lot to have, and you say, come over here and have some of this. And then you notice he's got no coat, so you have a little whip round and get him a coat, and then that's what he means. Now none of that's in the law of Moses. He means use your common sense and do something practical instead of just talking. That's what he means. He's not talking about the law of Moses. He's talking about doing things. In verse 17 he says, so faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. You see? So what he's saying is, if you're just saying you believe stuff, but you do nothing about it, nothing changes, nothing happens, nothing stops, nothing starts, nothing is different, well, what have you got? You're just basically asserting some proposition, giving assent to some kind of proposition. Well, the devil can do that. The devil knows that all sorts of stuff, and he believes it more with greater conviction than we do. That's not faith. Faith is believing and enacting upon it. It's not because the acts make you righteous, it's because the acts that are consequent upon your faith are the evidence that you've got faith. Do you see? That somehow has become confused with James being in favour of continuing to observe the law of Moses as being some kind of requirement. How could you misunderstand this? And yet people do. So James says in verse 18, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will by my works show you my faith. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you see? So what James is saying is just what I've just mentioned to you. He's talking about being real, not being phony. Being legitimate, the real McCoy, not just a talker who says he believes things. Verse 20, do you want to be shown, you shallow man, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac upon the altar? ? Now, what Abraham did in offering his adult son Isaac on the altar, by the way, what Isaac did in allowing himself to be offered on the altar as an adult man also was faith. But it was also works. So what they did, it was a work, but it was a work which evidenced faith. Isaac, as a 30-year-old man getting up on that altar and not doing anything to protect himself, was faith. What was Isaac's faith? Isaac believed he'd be resurrected. What was Abraham's faith? Abraham believed Isaac would be resurrected because they totally believed the promise. What was the promise? That through Isaac shall your descendants be named. Through him. They're going to be the people of God. They're going to be the descendants through whom the whole world will be blessed. And then God says, go and sacrifice Isaac. Now, this work that Abraham did, and Isaac, but this work that Abraham did, justified him. How? Because the work that Abraham did in offering Isaac constituted very real, actual, profound proof of his faith, didn't it? How could he have shown his faith better than by doing that? Do you see? He believed God, that it doesn't matter what happens to Isaac, God will do something to resurrect Isaac in order that God's promise will be fulfilled. That's the faith Abraham had. Now, this thing that we call a work, or James calls a work, when was this thing done? This was done hundreds of years before the law of Moses even came into existence. Remember, Abraham is the ancestor of Moses, not the other way around. And so Abraham was doing a thing called a, speech marks, work, 400 odd years before Moses even was born. Do you see? And therefore, what Abraham did was not a work of the law. It was a work. It was works. So the word works is not a dirty word, not a swear word, although it's treated as one. It isn't one. And it says in verse 22-23, you see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by works. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay? So what's it saying? That the faith that we need in order to be saved is completed by works. It's totally consistent with works. Indeed, it requires that there be works in order to prove its existence. So it's like saying smoke is totally consistent with fire. So when you see a fire, you don't say, I can't understand it. There seems to be like a kind of grey sort of thing coming off it. What could that be? You say, no, that's totally consistent with fire. Smoke is totally consistent with fire. Indeed, so consistent that the absence of smoke would cause me to doubt whether there is a fire. That's what he means. And he's not talking about the law of Moses. James is not speaking about the law of Moses at all. He's speaking about this thing called works. Okay, and he gives another example of Rahab the harlot. He says in verse 24, 25, 26, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so faith apart from works is dead. Now what did Rahab do? What Rahab did was not included within the 613 commandments. There wasn't a commandment saying, trick the residents of Jericho so that the spies in Jericho can escape and that they will get away safely. Wide though the law of Moses was, there wasn't a command saying that. So what did she do? She did a work. She did a work to demonstrate her faithfulness to them and her allegiance to them. She later became part of the people of God. She joined them when the Israelites came in. She joined them, became part of it, became part of the Jewish people. But what did she do? It wasn't adherence to any particular part of the law of Moses. It wasn't that at all. She was just doing something to demonstrate her faithfulness and her loyalty to them. That's what she did, for which she was commended. So, what James is saying, and remember, of course, put it in context, James is the same man that stood up at the Jerusalem Council and endorsed Paul and said the things he said about the law being at an end. We're not subject to it, we needn't be circumcised, etc., etc. He couldn't more clearly and emphatically endorse and commend Paul than he did. It's unmistakable. And I say that because people keep mistaking it and thinking that James and Paul didn't get on and that they belonged to opposite camps. They absolutely didn't. See? And so, a few extra little bits and bobs. In terms, I spoke earlier about Jesus could not be a priest, and neither could we, but for that matter, couldn't be a priest because that was forbidden by the law of Moses. But you'll see that within Exodus 28 and also Exodus 29, and you'll see, as I said, in Leviticus chapter 11 about things being unclean or an abomination, and yet how the Bible says that they're not. Paul says they're not. Peter says they're not. Peter was told that they're not. They're not unclean. Call nothing unclean. Well, that vision that Peter had was inconsistent with Leviticus 11, wasn't it? So either the vision was wrong or Leviticus 11 is wrong, or neither is wrong, but the one has been replaced by the other. And so let me just finish off by saying a little bit about taking us back to the Sermon on the Mount, because I dealt with this in talk number 8. The Sermon on the Mount is basically Matthew 5, 6 and 7. And Jesus stands up by the mountain and speaks to a crowd right at the beginning of his ministry. So we're in the very early stages of his earthly ministry in Matthew 5. And there's been a lot of confusion as to what that talk was about. Because remember how I dealt with those particular verses about how he had not come to destroy the law. Remember, I dealt with that in talk number 8. And if anyone wants to go back to that, look at talk number 8 in this series, where I deal with it, those specific verses. But I'm not looking now at the Sermon on the Mount in general. What was it? What was it all about? Because it sounds a little bit like Jesus is giving us a set of rules to live by. And how many times have you heard people say that? Yes, but you know, what I believe in is living by the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I've yet to meet a person that even remotely lives by the Sermon on the Mount. If there is such a person, I really would like to join his fan club, because I've never met one yet. Have you? What is it then? What's Jesus talking about? So some people say, well, it's rules for kingdom living. It's how a Christian should live. Well, in a certain sense you could say that, but not really. It's not a new law to abide by. It's not a new set of requirements for us. It isn't that. Others say it's the conditions for being a Christian, the conditions for being saved. Well, it's not that either, because if it was that, it would be requiring works in order to be saved. And James wasn't doing that. James was saying we're saved by faith. I just want to see evidence that you've got faith. It's not that you're saved by your works. So if we were to say that adherence to the Sermon on the Mount is a requirement, a prerequisite of being saved, that would be to totally misunderstand it. It's not that, because it's just too hard. None of us keep the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount's harder to keep than the Law of Moses, isn't it? The Sermon on the Mount it enhances, it adds to the Law of Moses and makes it even more difficult. So what then is it? What is the Sermon on the Mount? What's it about? Well, what I think it's about, it's an interpretation by Jesus of the Law of Moses. He's saying, here's my interpretation for you of the Law of Moses. And why would he do that? Because lots of people were doing that. Everyone was doing that. So if you went, different rabbis had different schools of thought about what the Law of Moses meant. That's what it was all about. People gave their interpretations. That's how we developed, or they developed, this thing called the oral law. What's the oral law? It's the amalgamated product of hundreds of different people's interpretations of the law, which clung like barnacles to the ship of the law. And out and out and out went the barnacles, adding to the law more and more extra bits and interpretations and definitions of what Moses meant by this, and precise definitions of how that had to be done, and what does it mean to work, and what does it mean to keep the Sabbath, and what exactly is work and what isn't work, and when exactly does it become evening time, and all these loads and loads of things that people spoke about and wrote about to interpret the law. And what I would put it to you is that what Jesus was saying in Matthew 5, 6 and 7 was his alternative interpretation of the law of Moses, in contrast to what? In contrast to the oral law that was at that time widely accepted. Accepted by whom? Accepted in particular by the Pharisees. Now remember how he kept having run-ins with Pharisees. Remember how Jesus kept walking through cornfields and doing various things without washing his hands in the right way. He was deliberately going around provoking people by just treading on the grass or stepping on the cracks in the pavement in order to break what? To break the oral law. He was not breaking the law of Moses. So what is the oral law? It's lots and lots of other people's interpretations of what? Of the law of Moses. And in Matthew 5, 6, 7, he's giving his interpretation of what does the law of Moses really mean and add up to and amount to. And amazingly enough, he actually makes it harder. He broadly defines murder, he broadly defines adultery. You think, well, I'm not doing badly, I've never committed adultery. But then you suddenly find you have. Because he says, if you even look at a woman, that's adultery. You think, well, I thought I was doing well, but now Jesus says I'm not doing well. Do you see? Oh, I've never been a murderer, I think I'm doing well. But then Jesus says that if you even hate someone or call him a fool or do all these other things, oh, hang on a minute, I thought I was doing well, but now I'm not doing well. So Matthew 5, 6 and 7 is in actual fact, I believe, to be seen in contrast to the prevailing oral law that loads and loads of the Pharisees believed in and Jesus didn't. And what he's essentially saying is, I don't go with your oral law. I don't hold with it. It's not valid. You've got it all wrong. I don't agree with all this stuff about not walking through cornfields in case the hem of your garment might knock a bit of wheat off and that would be harvesting. I don't hold with it that your foot might tread on a grain of wheat and that would be planting. It's not planting, that's not harvesting, that's a load of rubbish. That's what he's saying. You don't have to do all these silly things to observe the law of Moses. Let me tell you what the real law of Moses is really all about. And then he then goes on to give you these 3 chapters, which in some ways is the opposite of building a hedge around the law. Because you remember how the oral law was about building a hedge, making the law bigger, 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 bigger. So in some ways they made the law bigger and bigger and bigger, so you couldn't even go anywhere near breaking the law. And Jesus, hence all this, don't walk through a cornfield, that might be classed as harvesting. If your hem hits a head of wheat and knocks it off, that's harvesting. So Jesus is saying that's all nonsense, that's rubbish. No, he's not building a hedge around the law in that way. So in a sense he's bringing the law back down to size and knocking the barnacles off the ship. Do you see? All this stuff, this debris that's added itself to the law of Moses. So in a sense he's getting rid of that, but in another sense he's making things harder for us, isn't he? So in another sense his interpretation of adultery is a harder one for us, isn't it? His interpretation of murder is a harder one for us. But that's not building a hedge around the law. So what Jesus is doing is not building a hedge around the law as the adherents of the oral law were doing. He's giving you a correct interpretation of the law. Now, why is he talking about the law? You'll say now, I thought you told us that Jesus came to end and complete and fulfill the law. Why then would he be talking about the law? Surely he can't be. No, he was. You've got to read every passage of Scripture in its context. Part of the context is the time at which it was said. Now, when was Matthew 5, 6 and 7 said? Was it before or after the crucifixion and resurrection? It was before. Now, what was in operation before the crucifixion? The law of Moses. What was Jesus' stance in relation to the law of Moses at that time? Total observance of it and adherence to it and endorsement of it. So what would you expect him to do at that time other than completely endorse the law of Moses? Why would he do other? Why would he not do that? So he's totally endorsing it and he's explaining it and he's saying it's not all this stuff about building a great huge barrier and hedge around the law so you can't go anywhere near breaking it. That's nonsense. But let me explain to you what it really means, because the law of Moses is actually to be interpreted in relation to your heart attitude as well as your actual conduct. So when we talk of adultery, we don't just mean the literal act. What we mean is the heart attitude that gives rise to adultery and that in a very real sense is adultery. And so he's giving you his interpretation of the law of Moses without adding a hedge, but at the same time, in some ways, broadening it and making it a lot harder to do it. And yet not only did he keep the law of Moses, he kept his own interpretation of the law of Moses, which was even harder than the law of Moses. Do you see? So, the law of the Sermon on the Mount, as it's called, is not a set of rules for us to have to live by, because we could not even keep the law of Moses, never mind the more strictly, broadly defined interpretation thereof that he gives. We couldn't even keep the narrow one, never mind the broad, difficult one. Neither is it a condition for being saved. It is his interpretation at that time, underline the words, at that time, of the law of Moses, which at that time was in operation. But after his death, what became the status of the law of Moses? It ceased to be. So what are we now under? We are not under, as it were, the Sermon on the Mount, whereby we must adhere to the Sermon on the Mount and implement it as a kind of enhanced version of the law of Moses for us to be under. We're not under it. We're under the law of Christ, and we've dealt with that in earlier talks. We're saved by faith. The law of Moses is not binding us, and we are now to grow in maturity and learn to implement the principles of God's word and his character and change our characters and become like him and change and change and change in order to be like him, because we're growing up as sons and we've been appointed as junior directors on the board of directors of Jesus & Co., the business, and now you've been taken onto the board as a junior director, And what does Jesus want you to do over the next 30 years while you work for the company? Grow in ability, in faithfulness, in knowledge, in implementing the objectives of the company that he is the managing director of, as it were. Do you see? It's growing as a disciple of his in this new status that you have as a son, rather than a child being brought to school by a pedagogue. Remember? We dealt with that. So I wanted to finish with that because the Matthew 5 in particular is one of the key things that people will wave at you if you ever have the audacity to say that the law of Moses is over, because it's like the emblem, it's the real sort of main thing that people point to.
Does that mean then that we should aspire to live by Matthew 5 to 7?
Should we aspire?
To succeed, or is that all?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the question is, should we aspire to be like the people in Matthew, the things described in Matthew 5, 6 and 7? Of course. I mean, if you can, be. But the question is not, should you be like that? Of course you should be like that. The question is, are you under an obligation to observe those things as a law? Is there an obligation to observe the things that Jesus is saying there? Well, for a start, you're never going to. You're never going to succeed. So you can't become righteous by doing the things that Jesus says in Matthew 5, 6 and 7. The righteousness that you get has been imputed to you by a bank transfer. His bank has transferred it to your bank. That's how you got righteousness. Not by doing what the law of Moses said or by doing what Jesus said. You can't get righteousness by doing what Jesus said any better than by doing what Moses said. You see? It's not a means of acquiring righteousness. So should we do as Jesus said in Matthew 5, 6 and 7? Of course. It's best not to look at a woman lustfully. It's best not to say raka to people. It's best not to hate people. It's good not to do that. Or if you do those things, it's wrong, it's sinful. Of course it's sinful. But not doing those things will not make you righteous. Any more than not breaking the law of Moses will make you righteous. And there isn't one of us here today who has ever kept the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, you've got a better chance of keeping the law of Moses than you have of keeping the Sermon on the Mount. Much better chance. So the Sermon on the Mount is right, just as the law of Moses was right. How could it not be right? The question is not, is it right? The question is it a law by which you are bound, which you have to be observant to, as any kind of precondition to salvation or anything else? The answer is no. What Jesus wants you to do is grow up. So you're appointed to the board by Jesus, and you'd say 21 years of age. What does Jesus want you to be 44 years later on your retirement day from the board of that company? He wants you to be much more mature, much more knowledgeable, having had a very good career in which you will have inevitably made mistakes and blunders. But during those times, the 65-year-old man who retires from the company, is he the same as or different from the 21-year-old man who was appointed to the company? He's different from him, isn't he? How? Is it that the 65-year-old man that leaves the company with a watch and everything else has never made a mistake while working for the company, he's never done anything wrong? No. He's just grown to be a much better man than he was when he joined at 21. That's what Jesus wants us to be and do as disciples. Do you see? But it's not that during your 44 years working for the company, you must never break a rule of Jesus or fail Jesus or let him down or do anything untalented or foolish or make a blunder. That's not what it is. It's becoming a much better worker, faithful, loyal, reliable, better and better as you go along. Not in order to be allowed to be part of the company. You're already in the company. Do you see? You were appointed at 21. You can't be any more of a director than you already are. You already are a director of the company. Do you see? You can't get... So your faithfulness will not make you a director. You want to be faithful because you're a director. Do you see? You can't become more of a director. You're either a director of the company or you're not. You see? Sorry?
I think there's an irony, isn't there, that the one thing that we're asked to do, and the very thing that we always fail in, is that in relation to the commandment, is love the Lord your God.
Yes.
With all your heart, with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself.
Yes.
That's interesting what you've said there.
Well, that in itself, you see, is another distillation of the law of Moses. So what Jesus has done, because he's very skilled at this, he would have been good on Twitter, is he can distill a thing. So what you've just said about love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself, he's taken the whole law of Moses and the Sermon on the Mount and said, right, let's put it into tweet form. So he's put it into 140 characters. Now that statement effectively contains within it the entire Bible. Do you see? That's the point. So it's his interpretation given in a much shorter format. So that's the end of Talk 12. And although I can see you're all weeping that this won't be carrying on, that's the end of the Galatians series.
Fantastic.